Russell, here today on the first ever podcast for the Sustainable Conversations podcast hosted by Earth Capital. Really great to have Neil here today from Net Zero Now, and we're going to be talking a little bit about their recent M&A process. So thank you, Neil. Thank you for coming along.
Thank you for having me.
If you're happy to, it'd just be great to hear a little bit about your background, a little bit about your role at Net Zero Now and their positioning as well, if possible.
Yeah, no problem at all. My background could fill up probably the entire podcast. So I'll do a very, very quick skip through a range of very, very different roles in very, very different industries, leading to about 10 years as an independent management consultant, advising clients on largely on strategy and business development, with a whole range of clients, including Virgin Galactic, BBC Worldwide, or BBC Studios, as is now, Soho House Group, and various others, leading to lockdown, ultimately, and then coming out of lockdown, having a chat with a couple of friends of mine, and one of them outlining this very interesting new business model in the world of carbon accounting, which is what evolved into Net Zero Now. And the reason it's, I guess, piqued my interest is because of the nature of the business model, which was an absolutely perfect alignment between sort of purpose and profit. So this idea that if we can create a business that is doing good with every pound of revenue it brings in, then we can really drive or use that kind of profit motive and that profit incentive that comes with a great deal of momentum to really drive impact and to drive a sort of a better world for us all. And the idea behind it was also very elegant, I thought. So the basically Net Zero Now is one of a huge number, if I'm honest, of carbon accounting platforms that exist out there in the market now. It's a new industry. It's something that businesses are just beginning to get their heads around. And at its very heart, there's quite a sort of simple process of kind of X times Y. You know, how many miles did you drive in a car, multiplied by an emissions factor for that particular type of car. But that simplicity belies a huge amount of kind of complexity underneath it, which is really that any accounting discipline needs to have consistency and credibility, and the data needs to be comparable, most importantly. So it's no good having two different businesses measuring their carbon emissions and doing their carbon accounting in totally different methodologies and totally different ways, because obviously the results then become meaningless. And the Net Zero Now philosophy, if you like, was that we can take the global guidelines that exist in carbon accounting, so things like the GHG protocol and the SBTI targets, and really interpret them on a sector level. And really the inspiration there was very much from financial accounting, where, as you probably know, there are global guidelines, but how businesses in one sector report their revenue and treat their costs might be different to the next sector. And that's something that's evolved over 100 plus years of financial accounting, being a discipline. We've only had 10 or so years of carbon accounting being a discipline. So our goal was to always fast forward that process and get to a stage where every business in every sector had a very, very clear methodology of exactly how they should be measuring and reporting and reducing their emissions, such that we got to a world where you had alignment and consistency and credibility in all of that data, which then allowed for businesses to actually realize the commercial benefit from carbon accounting, because only then can you credibly go to your customers, your consumers, your employees, your investors, and say genuinely we are moving forward on our climate journey in the right way. So it was about not only having that alignment of purpose and profit within the business ourselves, but also being able to take or demonstrate to our customers that they could benefit commercially through taking climate action.
Yeah, amazing. I think that really, really interesting. And I know in your approach, you had a very sector focused vertical approach.
Yeah.
And so maybe you could speak to that a little bit and how that grew and developed across multiple sectors from when you founded the business.
Yeah, so the growth was partly organic. And so my co-founder, Simon Hepner, had set up something called the Sustainable Restaurant Association in the past. And the first sector that we worked in was hospitality. So we worked very closely with Coca-Cola and Pernod Ricard to develop a standardized methodology for pubs and bars and restaurants to measure and report their carbon emissions. once we'd established well, I was going to say once we'd established that, as we were establishing that, we sat down and had a slightly more strategic discussion about the next sectors we should be looking at, and realised actually hospitality, although that's where Simon's heartland was, it's where his experience was, where his contacts were. In truth, it wasn't strategically the best sector to be looking at because it's low margins. There isn't an obvious sort of demand driver in that sector for businesses to be measuring their emissions, and it's also really, really complicated because the sheer volume of data that comes if you're buying millions of tomatoes and tons of beef and all the other various different ingredients that go into a restaurant over the course of 12 months. It's a very complicated thing to do. So we then started looking at things like professional services, so accountancy, law, tech, things like that, where actually there is a much clearer level of demand because they're in a supply chain with those big organizations who are asking their suppliers to ensure that they're taking climate action in the right way. They're higher margin businesses, so they've got more of an appetite for spending money on these things. And they're much simpler to measure. The truth is that you've got many, many fewer data points if you are people in an office compared to delivering a professional service compared to something like a restaurant. So it was for all those reasons. That's more the angle, the direction we took. But the approach was still very, very similar. We were and still are a relatively small business, so it's not about us going into a sector and trying to dictate what that methodology should be. It's about us going into the sector and trying to pull together the key players of that sector to reach a consensus on what that methodology should be, and then leveraging those the voice and the reach that those players have in the market to try and establish that as the industry standard approach for carbon accounting in the sector.
Amazing. And so you started with the hardest sector first and then decided to make life easier
yes.
for
We
yourself.
cut our teeth on the hardest one we could possibly find just to make sure we establish the principle first.
Yeah. I think that's great. And I think, at Capital, I think we found really interesting about the business is that sector specific approach and creating that standardized methodology, which, as you said, carbon accounting hasn't had the time necessarily to do, like financial accounting. So obviously you've just been through an M&A process and a successful one at that. Are you able to share a little bit about what your kind of motivations were behind that deal and how you went into it, really?
Yeah, absolutely. So we went into the process not really thinking that necessarily M&A was going to be or sale of the business was going to be the outcome. We went into it very much in growth mode. We expected to grow through investment and building the business through our own efforts. And we found when we got into the process alongside you and your colleagues that whilst there was some interest from financial investors, and we spoke to a lot of them thanks to your hard work, the opportunity came along with Ecologi, which added a bit more than just the financial investment. It added a sort of strategic element which the financial investment wouldn't have provided, which was being able to access their brand, their awareness of the brand that Ecologi had built up, which was very, very impressive. They'd been around for a couple of years longer than we had and had sort of ridden an early wave in terms of climate action and climate funding, which hadn't necessarily been there in the sort of B2B world that we went into a couple of years later. So they had a very, very well-established and well-regarded brand in the market. They were a bigger business than us, so that gave us the sort of scale that we were looking for. But also because they're combining a set of really adjacent services in the climate world, it meant we had a more attractive and valuable proposition, a go-to-market proposition. So it was more of a case that we became greater than the sum of the parts by putting these two things together, whereas a financial investment would have obviously allowed us to grow, but we would have still been sort of under our own steam, so to speak. So, as I say, we went into the process very much with our eyes open that might be the outcome, but that wasn't necessarily what we were looking for or expecting. But once you guys introduced us to Ecologi and a few other trade players, I think we were very interested by that route because it was a kind of fast forward. It enabled us to fast forward to a position of significant scale in the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting is the kind of strategic alignment as well between Net Zero Now and Ecologi. And so it might be useful to share just a bit of information on Ecologi and their positioning and what now the combined group looks like.
Yeah, so Ecologi are very much, or have traditionally been very much focused on climate funding, climate action. So initially that meant planting trees and the things that we all remember from sort of 5 or 6 years ago at the start of this journey. And now means still some trees are being planted, but it's also all sorts of a whole wide range of different climate impact funds, nature restoration funds, biodiversity funds. So providing businesses an opportunity to invest in nature restoration and climate action and carbon removals and sequestration and all sorts of good things. And therefore, as I said before, very much an adjacent set of services to what Net Zero Now would traditionally do, which was measuring the carbon emissions in the first place. So as you rightly point out, a really interesting strategic combination, because many of their customers were already coming to Ecologi saying, well, we understand you're funding the climate action. We need somebody to help us measure. And many of our customers were saying, okay, now we've measured and we've gone through some reduction, which is always the first thing before you start sort of funding the climate action. Reduction is the most important thing for every business. But even then, there are often hitting a brick wall with the reduction. There are emissions that they simply cannot reduce. So a lot of our customers were wanting to take that next step, and we couldn't help them. So bringing these two things together provides more of a, I mean, it's a cliche, but a one-stop shop, an end-to-end solution for climate strategies. And it means that we can sort of own that customer journey, really hold their hands right the way through the process, from people who know absolutely nothing about this journey and the process and want to start their climate strategy and their climate journey, all the way through to those who are pretty well established and mature and know exactly what they want to do. But we can support every type of business with the combined services that the two businesses provide.
Amazing. And I think that's a fantastic alignment, really. And as you said, you're providing customers with, that full stack solution, but a full path on their climate action journey. And that is so important. So obviously now the deal is complete. Kind of what are the next steps? I think it'd be great to hear a little bit about what the next steps are for the combined group and what the top priorities are, but also maybe a little more broadly as well into the sector. What do you think is coming to the carbon accounting sector as a whole, and how will that change?
Wow, lots of questions.
Two questions.
Two questions. Well, the first one already had lots of parts to it. So
yeah,
I think, what next? Obviously, there is the very kind of pragmatic stuff. There's the integration of two businesses. There's the integration of two brands. There's the integration of two technology backends, and all sorts of work streams that we are currently operating in order to bring this together and to create one sort of consistent business that we're presenting to the market. And I don't know if you've ever been through a process like that, but there's a huge number of moving parts, even when there are businesses that are relatively small like ours. That's all in train. Some of those issues are, as you can imagine, knottier than others. But I think the one thing that we have found so far is there's been an incredibly good cultural fit between the two organisations. And that goes a hugely long way in sort of easing the path for everything else. So we've been incredibly lucky. That's not really anything you can judge beforehand or easily judge beforehand. And so we've been very lucky to that extent. Beyond that, in terms of the sort of strategy for the business, part of the reason that they were interested in looking at us was that sector-based approach and the idea of establishing Ecologi now, which will be the combined brand, as a really credible market leader, which is providing a really valuable service very specifically into certain sectors and certain business groups. We're a bit more fluid with our definition of the word sector. It's not just traditional sort of industry sectors we're looking at. It's also other sort of groups of like-minded and similarly structured businesses that we might be targeting. But ultimately, it's about working with partners to stand on the shoulders of the giants around us in order to provide bespoke solutions for specific groups of businesses alongside those partners. So it's leveraging that, again, the reach and sort of engagement and authority that those partners have to provide solutions to those groups of businesses. So lots of, I won't go into detail, but there are lots of opportunities we're looking at, as well as obviously lots of cross-sell opportunities within the combined customer base. So lots and lots of things on our plate at the moment.
Fantastic. Lots to do then.
Lots to do. Exactly, and now I've forgotten the second part of the question.
No, that's fine. I think probably best to break it down anyway. I think, from where you understood kind of Net Zero Now's positioning to be in the market and what you were seeing around you in the carbon accounting market, how do you think that's going to change in the coming years?
Sorry, that was the other half. So I think one of the reasons that we went to market when we did, in terms of us looking for investment, was because we could absolutely see, and I'm still absolutely confident that is coming down the line. We're already seeing it, and that's consolidation.
Yeah.
I said before, there are many, many, many carbon accounting platforms out there. It's very, very typical of any new industry. There's huge fragmentation, and that's not going to last. There is not room in the market for hundreds and hundreds of carbon accounting platforms. So that consolidation, we're already seeing it. That lots of people are struggling, and I feel for them. But I mean, the truth is, it's just not sustainable to have whatever it is, 150 different carbon accounting platforms. So there will inevitably be that consolidation, and we're obviously now very, very well placed to sort of ride that wave and be there at the end of that process. And we wouldn't. I don't think anybody on our side of the fence would rule out further consolidation on our side, because obviously we've got a really good range of products and services now, but there are always new things that we can add, more new strings we can add to that bow. And then, I mean, I suppose in the market in general, if you think about the demand side, so with the obvious £800 gorilla in the room being what's going on in America at the moment, and that's clearly not helpful when you've got a major government sort of trying to pull back from climate commitments. But the truth is, on the commercial side, we're not really seeing a huge amount of impact of that. I'm sure we may in the long term, but businesses that have made climate commitments are not reversing those climate commitments in the speed with which the US government is at the moment. They are committed to this. They're on a journey. And a lot of them, it's huge investment and it's long-term planning. So they're not going to flip-flop and change, because they kind of know that this is real and it's going to come back to them. So if they reverse it now, they're just going to have to reverse it again in 3-4 years time, hopefully. So we're not seeing that change. We are still seeing the growth. I mean, perhaps a little slower than we'd all thought a couple of years ago, because I think the economy has put a dampener on that growth to a certain extent. Businesses wanting to do the right thing but simply not able to afford it at this point in time. So I think that growth has perhaps been slowed, but it's still definitely the direction of travel is still very, very positive in terms of the demand side of the business. On the kind of supply side, I think the range and credibility of projects that we are funding is just increasing exponentially, and that's really, really exciting. The global guidelines, the SBTI in particular, are getting more focused on the funding of climate action as being part of a credible climate strategy. They've just released some new guidelines in the last few weeks and months that are well, not quite compelling, but encouraging businesses to be funding climate action earlier in their climate journey than they had before, which to our minds, despite that, and our business, but more importantly to our minds, is absolutely the right thing to do. Holding off on funding climate action was always a quite slightly counterintuitive thing for somebody like the SBTI to be encouraging. So we're really pleased that they're moving on that position. So I think on the demand side, I think both more businesses will be coming into the market for the climate market, if you like, and more of those businesses will be looking to do the full sort of range of climate strategy in terms of measurement, reduction, and restoration and reporting, as well as opposed to them simply just measuring and reporting. So I think it's pretty positive at the moment, and I think we feel like we're in a good place.
Amazing. Really interesting, but also great to hear that there's some positivity still in there and still some momentum, regardless of the £800 gorilla. So
yeah,
very good. Okay, so switching tack slightly from the kind of the market and the business and the positioning there to more on the kind of M&A process and how you found that process itself. I think it'd be useful to understand a little bit about what the biggest challenges you faced during that was, and how you kind of balance those with what the business is looking to do.
I think the biggest challenge undoubtedly was the time it took. We had fantastic support from you guys, and that was invaluable. I think that your ability to extend the reach and get us in front of many, many more people was really, really important. You obviously introduced us to Ecologi, so that ended up being the deal that we did. So that was all really, really valuable. And the work that I had to do was entirely separate. This is not something that anybody else could have done. The truth is, we Net Zero now, we're a very small business. Ecologi is not an enormous business. We're still really in startup mode. But when you have legal due diligence, strategic due diligence, financial due diligence,
Yeah.
tax due diligence, post-merger integration
Mm.
discussions, all sorts of things going on, and you are literally the conduit for absolutely every single one of those things, it takes an inordinate amount of time.
Yeah.
And I kind of, we all knew that going into it, but I think, there's no way you could ever underestimate the time that takes.
Sure.
And that's on top of the day job. You've
Mm.
still got all the day job things you need to be doing. So I think that is certainly. I mean, I don't really know what lesson I should take from that if I were to ever to go through it again, because I don't know if it ever could be avoided. Because the truth is, there is no other way of doing it other than everything going through me. But so I'm
Yeah.
not quite sure if that's what advice I can give to anybody following in my footsteps, other than be prepared.
I
But it
think
is,
that's
and
good
it,
advice, to be fair.
maybe the sort of day job is the one you have to look at. See if you can
Yeah.
find people. Make sure that the other people are prepared for the fact that you won't be answering emails immediately. You won't be quite so focused because you've got another full-time day job to be doing on the side. So that's probably and warm your family and your
Yeah.
pets and everybody else that you are not going to be taking the dogs for a walk. You're not
Yeah.
going to be available at weekends. It's a very, very full-on process, but all the way through from the search initially, and then the obviously the sort of negotiation and due diligence processes are incredibly time consuming. But it is what it is. You can't really
Yeah.
cut corners. That's the whole point about due diligence. There's not much point in doing that and cutting corners. So there was no one. You can't blame people for that. It's just the way that it is. But it is a huge amount of work.
Yes, absolutely. There's no getting around it. It's a very time intensive process, and I think you handled it admirably the entire way through. But I hope you have found some time to give yourself a little bit of a break post post the
But
deal being
that
closed.
is my advice actually. Is
Yeah.
well, my first bit of advice is however long you think it's going to go on for, add another month, probably 2 months to the end of your
Yeah.
estimate, and then the next one is try and book a holiday just after that. And as
Absolutely.
luck would have it, I timed that very, very well. So about 2 weeks after we closed the deal, I did have a very nice week in the Alps skiing,
Oh, good.
which was one of the best holidays I've had in years, just because of
I'm glad. That's, I
yeah.
think, absolutely well deserved. So I think that's good to hear. I think, and given that obviously it is a time intensive process, and as you said, there's no kind of really getting around the input you need to give as a founder in that process. And so I think it would be useful to understand a little bit of how what do you think the best thing and the best role of a financial advisor is in that, in order to kind of ease the entire process and facilitate it.
Um, it's a really good question. I mean, I think I'd start. I know this is not an answer to the question you've actually asked me, but I just did think of one other piece of advice, which
Oh,
is
great. Yeah.
to keep your house in order.
Yes.
So at the beginning of a startup journey, it's tempting just to be firing out contracts left, right, and centre, and not to worry too much about whether customer A has fully signed exactly the right piece of paper and things like that.
Yeah.
Any proper due diligence process will reveal every
Mm.
wrinkle that might exist within your business. So keeping your house in order from day one, even when you're a small and scrappy startup, is really, really helpful for when you get to that process. If you've got even the boring stuff, have you got everything filed in a way that you're going to be able to find it 3 years down the line when somebody tells you to ask you, what about that customer contract right there? Being able to find that, being confident it's got the right signature on it,
Mm.
it's up to date, it hasn't been breached, it's all those
Yeah.
kind of things. So keeping that kind of admin side, filing the really, really boring stuff that is not part of the kind of glamorous side of the startup story, but it's incredibly important when you get to that process. So
Yeah.
not to do with the financial
Very good
advisors,
advice,
but
though.
a bit of
Agreed.
advice I would give is try and keep that filing in good order. Um, but the question about how can financial advisors support? I mean, I think making people aware of what that due diligence process is going to involve is really, really important. I mean, we all know it. The clue's in the name. The due diligence is always going to be, a really intensive process with them kicking the tires very, very carefully on the entire business.
Mm.
And being prepared for that and thinking ahead, thinking about what the business your acquiring business or the business you're talking to, what is it that they're interested in? Why are they looking to buy you, and really being able to demonstrate the value that you're providing, particularly in that negotiation process. Because there's two phases really to any of these conversations. One is the negotiation up front, getting to the heads of terms, when you've agreed all the key elements of the deal. And then the other is the much longer and more painful piece normally is that due diligence process. And so on the first bit, It's the support that you guys gave us in the negotiation. It's thinking about negotiation strategy. You know, what's valuable to them, and how can we really emphasise that? How can we paint the business in the best possible light? And then the due diligence process is really much more about internal. There's much less that the financial advisors can do to support that bit, because they're not going to help you dig through your own filings for
Yeah.
those contracts. But that first bit, I think it's around maximising the initial value of the business.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that is absolutely important. And you are right. I think giving fair warning at the beginning of an M&A process about what the how it will really look, I think is very important. Okay, well, final question for me, but what advice would you give other founders who are looking towards potentially doing an M&A deal, and how to approach that?
Um, I would first of all say, I mean, in terms of taking on external advisors. I mean, obviously, it's dependent on everybody's individual situation. We found it incredibly useful. We had what I would have thought a relatively good network of potential investors and things like that. But there really isn't a substitute for going to professional advisors who have got a much fuller Rolodex and many more contacts, and can really get you in front of as many people as you possibly can, because you never quite know where those people are who are going to really see the value in your business. And that sometimes will come from slightly left field. We had one or two conversations with businesses that we didn't know about in advance, and actually they saw our business in quite a different light, and they saw different areas of value in the business. And so being able to understand that, and able to understand how your business is perceived externally, is a really valuable thing. So that's something that corporate finance advisors like yourself can bring to the table. And I think, other than that, I mean, be prepared to kiss a lot of frogs. You will be having
Yep.
an awful lot of conversations. Hopefully, everybody will be very complimentary about your business, and everyone will tell you how great your business is. But don't be fooled into thinking that means they're going to sort of make an offer the next day, because 99 out of 100 of those will probably come to nothing. But people will always be polite, and people will always want to stay in touch, because it doesn't make sense for any of them to be burning bridges. If you it's easy to get very over enthusiastic from a sort of positive meeting and think, oh, this is great, they're gonna make an offer tomorrow, when actually they're having that same conversation with hundreds of businesses, because that's what they do, and they want to stay in touch with you, because they might want to invest now, they might want to invest in 2 years' time. So very few people are just going to say no straight off the bat, and so it's very tempting to get carried away with some of the positive meetings you've had. So I guess I don't know what the message is there, but be very cynical about those ones, and try and identify the ones that you think are seriously interested.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also what I would add in that is that I think my approach would always be, actually, it's always worthwhile having those conversations, because you never know. You are absolutely right. Have a bit of cynicism about where it's going to go, but I think always good, particularly if it's in the market you're in, always good information to be learning, people to be meeting, and you never know when those might come in the future, handy in the
Yeah.
future.
100%, and I think cynicism is probably my word, but it's probably a bit too harsh a word. I think it's more about sort of hoping for the best but expecting the worst. I think that's
Yes,
it. I think
for sure.
the danger is you get two or three people sounding positive, and you think that's it, the job's done, I found the people who are going to, and then
Yeah.
when they don't happen, you find yourself starting again at sort of square one. I think it's just understanding that is the world that we're in here. That everybody's going to be pleased to see you. Everyone's going to have a nice conversation, and we always should be hoping for the best, but maybe expecting the worst. Just so that you're
Absolutely.
constantly looking for the next thing.
Absolutely, and it's a tough process to go through it as a founder, but you guys did fantastically, and I'm so glad to have seen the deal complete so successfully. So I think that's all of my questions, and so thank you, Neil. I really
No
appreciate the
problem at
time.
all.
You're so kind to have joined. So thank you
No
very much
problem.
for joining, and we will share this very soon.
Very good. Well, thank you for having me, and I look forward to watching it.